India after the Guptas. The objectives are 1. Discuss how Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam influenced the development of India. And 2, explain why India's location made it a center for trade and why conflicts among its states plagued its growth. Now, the decline of Buddhism inevitably occurred within India. Buddhism was initially quite popular among the Indians in that it allowed the freedom of the strict class-based hierarchy through karma and rebirth through reincarnation. But over time, people really began to argue over really how to follow the Buddha's teachings. And one particular school emerged, known as Theravada, which is the original teachings of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. And it's often referred to as the teachings of the elders. And it's not really a religion as much as a way of life. Yes, it's concerned with obtaining the afterlife, to reach nirvana, to moksha, to cessation of existence through ending of suffering and desire. But the core idea is not devotion to a particular god, but to a meditation. Now, the other discipline that emerged was Mahayana, which is a view in which nirvana could be achieved through devotion to the Buddha. And so, in this sense, the Buddha becomes a deity in himself, in whom we worship and follow to reach nirvana through him. So Theravada's teachings were too strict because it demanded one to meditate and to inevitably cross that river into nirvana. Through this, the devotion to the Buddha, one might gain access. So through Mahayana Buddhism really became a religion. And Buddha is not a wise man, but a divine figure in Mahayana. And the Buddha went through several reincarnations to try to be among the people, to show the path to nirvana. And so now you have various forms of the Buddha emerge through life and interacting with people. So really neither sect remained quite popular in India for very long. We saw Theravada decline, and Mahayana really ends up being absorbed into Hinduism, allowing the Buddha to become just another one of the gods, of the many gods in the polytheism of Hinduism. Buddhism, however, spread to China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and Japan by missionaries and tradesmen along the trade routes. And here, in these locations, Buddhism thrives and blossoms. But also we see the intersection of another religious tradition, Islam. In the early 8th century, Islam became popular in what is now modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. It had reached the borders of what we know as India. And Islam expanded into the region when the Gupta Empire collapsed in that northern region. And they developed in the region over time, particularly forming a state called Ghazni, an Islamic state present in present-day Afghanistan. And this state will grow in power and prowess and inevitably expand into India. And this is particularly done by Mahmud of Ghazni, which is the son of the founder of this kingdom. And he took control of the new state in 997. He was ambitious. He began to attack various neighboring Hindu kingdoms and expand into that Indian territory. And really his empire stretched from the upper Indus Valley to as far as the Indian Ocean, really controlling those trade networks that would allow it to thrive. And resistance ultimately was offered from the Indians themselves, a resistance led by the Rajputs, which are Hindu warriors. But ultimately it didn't stop the rise of this Islamic state. So the Hindus really couldn't stop these invaders in their advances. And by 1200, we see Muslim power really stretching across northern India. And the Muslim state really became known as the Sultanate of Delhi. And by the 14th century, this power had expanded and extended all the way down to the Deccan Plateau, controlling the bulk of the Indian subcontinent, South Asia. But in other territories, other conquerors are taking great power. Really, by the late 14th century, we see the Sultanate begin to decline, and Timur-Lenk, a Mongol leader who was really based in power in Samarkand, and expanded into India, taking over those Sultanate powers. And he occupied Mesopotamia, Persia, the Caspian Sea, the Pamir Mountains, really expanding dramatically the power base through the region. Now, it's after his death in 1405 that a new nomadic tribe arose and threatened India, and they are known as the Mughals. And here you can see on the map the outline of this massive empire that will emerge. Now, Islam and the Indian society in general will blend and influence one another. The many Muslim rulers were particularly intolerant of other faiths. They demanded and insisted upon Islam. And they usually used peaceful means to try and convert people to Islam, but there over time emerged an uneasy tolerance that began to develop. And now it wasn't always tolerant. In fact, there was conflict at many periods. But inevitably, a settled peace does emerge. Now, ultimately, we can note architecture as a major influence and blend between Islam and Hinduism. Really, from the 700s on, we see Indian architects build monumental Hindu temples, to be sure, and we see central shrines surrounded by a tower, a hall for worshippers. But over time, we end up seeing a blending between the artistic traditions of the Islamic and Hindu cultures, the Islamic geometric ideas and the spires and the domes. We see a blend between that and the indigenous Hindu traditions as well. So culturally, politically, we see an influence upon one another over time. Now, the objectives were: 1, discuss how Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam influenced the development of India. And 2, explain why India's location made it a center for trade and why conflicts among its states plagued its growth.